Sednaya prison, located near Damascus, Syria, is infamous for its brutal conditions and reputation as a symbol of oppression. Under the regime of President Bashar al-Assad, here's an overview of its significance and the potential scenarios surrounding prisoners leaving the facility after the fall of Assad. About Sednaya prison location and purpose. Situated approximately 30 kilometers north of Damascus, Sednaya is a high-security prison operated by the Syrian government. Initially intended for military personnel, it later became a detention site for political prisoners, activists, and civilians accused of opposing the regime. Reputation. Described as a human slaughterhouse by Amnesty International. Reports of systematic torture, forced confessions, executions, and inhumane living conditions have emerged from survivors and human rights organizations. Thousands of detainees have reportedly died from abuse, starvation, and disease within its walls. Secrecy. Access to the facility is highly restricted. The regime has consistently denied allegations of abuse, maintaining that Sednaya operates within legal norms. Eyewitness accounts and satellite imagery have been crucial in uncovering the horrors inside. Prisoners in Sednaya. Who are the prisoners? Political dissidents, human rights activists, journalists, and individuals arbitrarily detained. People accused of terrorism or rebellion, including those swept up in mass arrests during the Syrian civil war. Conditions: overcrowding, lack of medical care, and systematic dehumanization. Torture methods include beatings, electric shocks, and mock executions. Scenario: prisoners leaving after Assad falls. Post-Assad transition. If Assad's regime were to collapse, Sednaya's prisoners could potentially be released as part of a broader political transition or in response to international pressure. Such an event would likely reveal the scale of atrocities committed. Challenges: identifying survivors. Many prisoners are held without official records or communication with families. Trauma and rehabilitation. Survivors would require substantial psychological and physical rehabilitation. Justice and accountability. Exposing Sednaya's operations could bolster efforts to prosecute regime officials for war crimes. Global response. Human rights groups and international organizations would likely play a key role in documenting abuses and assisting survivors. Families of the disappeared would demand answers and closure. The release of Sednaya's prisoners would mark the end of a dark chapter in Syria's history, highlighting the resilience of those who endured unimaginable suffering and emphasizing the need for accountability and reform. Sednaya prison. Origins, history, and death toll. Construction and origins. Who built it? Sednaya prison was constructed by the Syrian government in 1987 during the rule of Hafez al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father. The prison was originally intended as a military detention center, but later became notorious as a high-security facility for political prisoners and dissidents. Estimated death toll. Number of deaths. According to a 2017 report by Amnesty International titled Human Slaughterhouse, between 5,000 and 13,000 prisoners were executed at Sednaya between 2011 and 2015 alone. The total number of deaths, including those from torture, starvation, and lack of medical care, is estimated to be tens of thousands since its inception. Execution methods. Most executions were carried out secretly, often by hanging. In nighttime mass executions, prisoners frequently died due to torture, disease, and starvation before being formally executed. Overall impact. Sednaya has become a symbol of the brutality of the Assad regime. Human rights organizations have documented testimonies of former detainees who describe the prison as a place of systematic dehumanization and violence. Notable reports. Amnesty International. The organization reported systematic killings that amounted to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Detainees often disappeared into Sednaya, with no records of their detention provided to families. Syrian Network for Human Rights, SNHR. Reports suggest over 130,000 Syrians have been forcibly disappeared across Syria, with many believed to have been sent to Sednaya. Sednaya prison stands as one of the starkest examples of human rights abuses in Syria's civil war. the sheer scale of atrocities makes it a key focus for international accountability efforts in the event of a regime change or post-conflict justice process. Reasons for silence on Sednaya's atrocities: the silence of courts, police, and even international organizations on the mass executions and systemic abuse. In Sednaya, prison can be attributed to several interwoven factors, including authoritarian control, fear, geopolitical interests, and the complexity of intervening in a sovereign state's internal affairs. 1. Why were Syrian courts and police silent? A. Authoritarian rule. Syria under the Assad regime, both Hafez and Bashar, operates as a dictatorship where the judiciary and police are tools of the regime rather than independent institutions. Courts were complicit. Syrian courts, including military tribunals, are known for rubber-stamping regime decisions. They do not function as impartial entities. Executions at Sednaya were often ordered by field courts or military courts, which held sham trials. Detainees were given no legal representation. Trials reportedly lasted only 1 to 3 minutes, ending in pre-decided death sentences. B. No accountability mechanisms. The regime bypassed formal judicial processes, making Sednaya a site of extrajudicial executions. Victims were often detained without charges or trials, accused vaguely of terrorism or threats to state security. Police stations and legal documentation were intentionally avoided to ensure that detainees disappeared without traceable records, limiting avenues for families to challenge detentions. 2. Why did the UN and international media remain silent? A. Lack of access and evidence. Sednaya prison is a high-security, secretive facility. No independent observers, journalists, or humanitarian organizations have been allowed inside. Survivors' testimonies emerged years later, often from individuals who fled Syria or were smuggled out. B. Geopolitical considerations. Syrian conflict is highly polarized, with major world powers backing different sides. Russia and Iran support the Assad regime and shield it diplomatically. Western countries, while condemning Assad, have prioritized fighting ISIS and managing the refugee crisis over confronting the regime. This polarization has made meaningful action by the United Nations Security Council (UNSC) almost impossible, as resolutions condemning Assad are often vetoed by Russia and China. C. Focus on broader conflict. International community focused primarily on the broader Syrian civil war, which has killed over 500,000 people, displaced millions, and involved chemical weapons attacks. Media coverage often prioritized immediate battlefield developments and ISIS atrocities over documenting the long-term abuses in prisons like Sednaya. 3. Why did local and global media fail? A. Regimes. Control of information. The Assad regime tightly controls the flow of information, suppressing dissent and criminalizing reporting on human rights abuses. Journalists and activists documenting Sednaya's abuses risked imprisonment, torture, or death. B. Delayed reports. Many detailed reports about Sednaya, such as Amnesty International's 2017 human slaughterhouse, emerged years into the war when global attention on Syria had waned. By the time these revelations surfaced, public fatigue over Syria's seemingly endless conflict had set in. C. Competing narratives. The Assad regime and its allies used propaganda and disinformation, labeling detainees as terrorists and dismissing reports of abuses as fabrications. This narrative made it harder for international media to convey the truth without appearing biased. 4. Challenges to international intervention. A. Sovereignty versus human rights. Sednaya atrocities occurred within Syria's borders, and interventions in such cases often face the argument of state sovereignty. The regime framed its actions as part of the war on terror, making intervention more politically sensitive. B. Lack of immediate solutions. Even when evidence of atrocities emerged, the fragmented international response to Syria's civil war made it difficult to prioritize prison abuses in a conflict involving chemical weapons, mass displacement, and other war crimes. C. Russia's shielding of Assad. Russia's diplomatic and military support for Assad included vetoing UN resolutions condemning Assad's crimes, spreading disinformation to discredit reports from human rights organizations and survivors. 5. Why did extrajudicial executions happen? A. Strategy of fear and control. The Assad regime uses mass executions and systematic torture to instill fear among the population and crush dissent. Sednaya became a symbol of this strategy of terror. Its secrecy ensured the regime could eliminate perceived threats without oversight. B. Wartime tactics. After the Syrian uprising began in 2011, Assad's government escalated the detention and execution of political opponents, activists, and civilians accused of supporting the opposition. The regime sought to streamline executions to prevent overcrowding in prisons and minimize public knowledge of detainees' fates. The silence around Sednaya's atrocities reflects the broader failure of both domestic and international institutions. While local courts were complicit in the regime's crimes, international actors faced challenges of access, geopolitical conflicts, and strategic priorities. However, ongoing efforts by survivors, human rights groups, and investigative journalists continue to shed light on Sednaya's horrors, with the hope of achieving justice and accountability in the future.